that something isn't right. It's not a visible breakdown nor a major tragedy. It's an intimate realization, a sense of always reacting, always adjusting one's emotional state to other people's moods, to circumstances, to careless words, as if peace of mind were never truly in one's own hands. The discomfort doesn't come from overwhelming pain, but from a lack of inner firmness. It comes from noticing that any comment cuts too deeply, that simple situations consume too much energy, that the mind never rests, because it is always trying to defend itself, explain itself, anticipate, correct. This kind of suffering is rarely recognized as suffering. It is normalized, mistaken for sensitivity, responsibility, maturity. The person learns to tell themselves that this is just how things are, that life requires this level of wear, that there is no alternative but to react, to worry, to become emotionally involved in everything. But little by little, something is lost. Clarity, inner dignity, the ability to remain whole even when the world does not cooperate. The root of this problem is rarely external. It forms quietly inside, over the years. It emerges when a person never learns to distinguish what truly deserves their attention from what merely seeks to provoke it. When presence is confused with exposure, when being human is mistaken for being affected by everything. From an early age, many people learn that they must respond to every stimulus. That silence is weakness. That not reacting is a sign of submission, that you must justify yourself in order to be respected. And so a dangerous psychological pattern is created, living with the mind turned outward, always shaped by the environment. Practical psychology observes this pattern clearly. When the point of reference is external, self-esteem becomes unstable. Personal value starts to depend on validation, on others' reactions, on outcomes that are not under one's control. This creates constant vigilance, a background tension, a state of alert that never fully switches off. The body feels it. The mind becomes restless, emotions fluctuate, and the person comes to believe that this is simply adult life. Stoicism appears precisely at this point of invisible exhaustion, not as lofty discourse, but as a direct response to this misalignment. Epictetus observed that human suffering did not come from reality itself, but from the relationship established with it. Even so, this ancient insight is still widely misunderstood. It is not about denying emotions, nor about hardening the heart. Stoicism never proposed insensitivity. It proposes inner hierarchy. It proposes that reason occupy its proper place, not to suffocate feelings, but to prevent them from ruling on their own. When reason abdicates, any stimulus gains excessive power. Praise lifts too high, criticism knocks down too hard, loss paralyzes, an unexpected event throws everything into chaos. The person becomes reactive, not from lack of intelligence but from lack of inner direction. This is the central point many avoid facing. Much of emotional instability does not come from life's intensity, but from the absence of solid internal criteria. Without these criteria, everything gets in. Everything weighs. Everything demands an immediate response. And the individual ends up living in a permanent state of vulnerability, even when, on the surface, everything seems fine. The problem deepens because this pattern is socially rewarded. Reactive people are seen as engaged. Those who care too much are seen as dedicated. Those who constantly explain themselves are seen as responsible. Few notice the internal cost. Over time, the mind fragments. Attention scatters. Emotional energy is drained. And a quiet question arises, rarely formulated clearly. Why does everything affect me so much? Epictetus would begin answering this by pointing to a basic confusion, the confusion between what depends on us and what does not. This simple, almost obvious distinction is ignored in everyday life, and ignoring it has deep consequences. When someone believes even unconsciously that they should control others' reactions, outcomes, opinions, external behaviors, they sentence themselves to continuous frustration. Because the world does not obey, people do not follow scripts, reality does not adjust itself to internal expectations. Frustration, then, does not come from the event itself, but from the expectation that it should have been different. And that expectation takes root early. It is taught, reinforced, normalized. The idea that if someone behaves a certain way, it says something definitive about who we are. The idea that personal value can be confirmed or denied by external events. This is a profound psychological error, one that Stoicism identified with precision long before modern theories existed. Seneca warned that suffering over what lies outside our control is a waste of our strength, not because the pain disappears, but because it becomes useless. It does not teach. It does not strengthen. It only consumes. But before this understanding becomes clear, the mind resists, because giving up external control feels, at first glance, like weakness, like resignation, like giving up, like accepting less than one deserves. In reality, it is the opposite. It is about reclaiming the only real control that exists. Even so, this idea does not settle in immediately. It must pass through layers of emotional habit, old beliefs, automatic reactions repeated without question. It must confront an identity built around reaction. Many people define themselves by how they react, by the intensity of their feelings, by how quickly they respond, by how many conflicts they engage in. Letting go of that is uncomfortable, because it requires redefining who you are when you are not reacting. And this is where a quiet fear appears. The fear of seeming indifferent, the fear of losing relevance, the fear of being seen as cold, the fear that by not reacting, something essential will be lost. Stoicism observes this fear calmly. It does not fight it directly. It exposes it. It shows that this fear is born from confusion between value and stimulus, between dignity and reaction, between presence and noise. When this confusion begins to be noticed, even vaguely, something shifts inside. It is not immediate relief. It is not total clarity. It is simply a crack in the automatic way of living. An uncomfortable sense that maybe it is not necessary to respond to everything, that maybe not everything deserves a place in the mind, that maybe peace does not depend as much on the world as once believed. But this perception is still fragile. It does not sustain itself on its own. It needs to be examined carefully, deepened, tested against real, everyday patterns. Because when one looks closely, it becomes clear that most suffering does not come from major events, but from repetition, from repeated reactions, repeated interpretations, repeated unmet expectations. And as long as these patterns are not seen clearly, the mind continues to react in the same way, convinced that the problem is always outside, unaware that the real prison may lie in how it has learned to respond to the world, again and again, day after day, almost without awareness. When you observe your daily routine with honesty, it becomes clear that it is not a single episode that disrupts the mind, but a predictable chain of automatic responses. The same irritation with delays, the same anxiety when someone takes too long to reply, the same need to explain intentions, the same expectation of recognition. The setting changes, the people change, but the internal reaction repeats itself with striking consistency. This pattern settles in because the mind seeks coherence. It prefers repeating what is familiar, even when it is painful, rather than facing the unknown. As a result, every ordinary situation becomes just another stage where old emotional habits step in. It is not the boss who creates the discomfort. It is not the family member. It is not the unexpected event. It is the internal mechanism that was already prepared to react in that way. Stoicism draws attention to this directly. Epictetus observed that faced with the same event, different people reacted in completely different ways. Some remained steady, others became unbalanced. The difference was not in the event, but in the judgment each person made of it. And yet, in everyday life, that judgment is rarely experienced as a choice. It is lived as a reflex. The person believes they reacted because there was no way not to react, that they were shaken because anyone would be, that they lost their temper because they were provoked. This kind of justification is comforting, but it keeps the pattern intact. As long as the reaction is blamed on the outside, Internal responsibility remains untouched. Over time, this way of functioning creates deep consequences. The mind begins to anticipate conflict. Neutral situations are interpreted as potential threats. Simple conversations carry invisible tension. Rest is never complete because internal vigilance remains active. In practice, this shows up in subtle ways. The person mentally revisits past conversations, imagining better responses, plans future discussions as if preparing for confrontation, relives old criticism as if it were still happening. All of this consumes mental energy, yet it is rarely recognized as a choice. It is dismissed as simply overthinking. Practical psychology identifies a common error here: confusing thought with usefulness. Not every thought serves a purpose. Many simply repeat unresolved emotional patterns. The problem is that without internal criteria, all thoughts are given the same weight. They all seem urgent. They all seem important. Stoicism proposes a filter, but it is not applied immediately. Before that, one must recognize one's own automatisms, and that requires observing patterns, not isolated events. Take, for example, recurring resentment. It is not explosive resentment. It is subtle, almost polite. It arises when things do not unfold as expected, when recognition does not come, when effort goes unnoticed. The person moves on, but something is recorded, a small emotional debt. Over time, these debts accumulate. Seneca warned that prolonged resentment corrodes the one who feels it more than the one who caused it. Even so, it is maintained because it feels like a form of internal justice, as if remembering the offense were a way to preserve dignity. In practice, the opposite happens. Dignity is handed over to the memory of what occurred. Another recurring pattern is the need for control disguised as care. The person gets overly involved in problems that are not theirs, offers opinions that were not asked for, anticipates consequences that may never happen. All of this is done under the banner of responsibility, but at its core lies anxiety. The mistake here is confusing influence with control. Influence is possible, control is not. When this distinction is unclear, every external situation becomes an emotional test. If the outcome does not match expectations, frustration arises. And that frustration repeats itself so often that it starts to feel like part of one's personality. There is also the pattern of excessive explanation. The person feels the need to justify themselves in order to be understood. They explain intentions, explain feelings, explain choices, often even when no explanation was requested. This comes from fear of being misunderstood. But paradoxically, the more one explains, the more dependent one becomes on others' interpretations. Epictetus saw this as a form of voluntary enslavement. When someone feels they must convince others in order to maintain their own peace, they have already lost their internal center. Peace becomes dependent on external agreement. In the long run, these patterns create silent exhaustion. The person feels tired without knowing exactly why, irritable without a clear cause, unmotivated even though life appears to be in order. This is a classic sign of conflict between one's way of living and one's internal structure. The mind begins to question, even if vaguely, whether it is possible to live differently. But that question is usually smothered by routine, by obligations, by the belief that now is not the time to change. Stoicism does not ignore this difficulty. It recognizes that emotional habits are hard to change because they provide a sense of identity. Reacting in a certain way helps a person recognize themselves. Letting go of that is uncomfortable because it creates a temporary void. Who am I if I don't react like this? Who am I if I don't care so much? That void is frightening, and so many prefer to keep the familiar suffering rather than risk a different posture. Even when they sense that something is wrong, they continue repeating the same behaviors, expecting different results. The long-term emotional consequences are clear. Constant reactivity weakens the capacity to choose. The mind becomes impulsive. Reason loses ground. Emotions begin to dictate the rhythm of life. And gradually, the person stops acting and starts merely responding. Stoicism sees this as a loss of autonomy, not externally, but internally. A person may be socially free yet internally conditioned, conditioned by stimuli, by opinions, by expectations. Even so, recognizing these patterns does not mean knowing what to do with them. Initial awareness only reveals the problem. It does not solve it, and that is frustrating, because the person sees where they are trapped, but cannot yet clearly see the way out. This tension between perception and action is uncomfortable. It is like seeing your own shadow projected on the wall and not yet knowing how to turn toward the light. But it is precisely this tension that prepares something deeper, because when the patterns are observed more closely, something begins to stand out. It is not the events that repeat themselves. It is the interpretations. It is not that people always behave the same way. It is the internal lens that remains unchanged. And when this realization begins to take shape, a more serious question arises, less emotional, more rational. A question that does not seek comfort, but truth. A question that, if taken seriously, can completely change how life is lived. But that question has not yet been fully formed. It is approaching slowly, as the mind grows tired of reacting the same way, carrying the same weights, repeating the same internal dialogues, sensing that perhaps the problem is not the world, but the way one has learned to position oneself within it. Something that now begins to demand a firmer, clearer, more radically honest look. This is where most people go wrong. Not because they lack intelligence or sensitivity, but because they insist on looking for solutions on the same level where the problem was created. They try to adjust external behavior, change people, avoid situations, control outcomes. All of this seems logical, but it ignores the core of the issue. The core was never outside. As long as attention remains focused on the environment, the mind keeps reacting. As long as a person believes relief will come when the world changes, they remain dependent on unstable factors, on chance, on other people's goodwill. The most common mistake is confusing inner strength with emotional endurance. Many believe that being strong means tolerating more, enduring more, putting up with more. Stoicism points in a different direction. Strength is not endlessly enduring what corrodes you. Strength is knowing what deserves entry into the mind and what does not. Here, a silent but profound shift takes place. The question stops being, "How do I keep this from happening to me?" and begins to turn into, "Why does this have this effect on me?" This change may seem subtle, but it alters everything, because it shifts the focus from the event to the judgment, from the outside to the inside, from automatic reaction to conscious observation. Epictetus insisted that it is not things themselves that disturb us, but the opinions we form about them. Many repeat this phrase without grasping its real implication. If disturbance is born from opinion, then freedom begins with examining that opinion, not with fighting the world. Most people never examine their own judgments. They live them as facts. If they feel offended, they conclude there was an offense. If they feel devalued, they conclude they were devalued. If they feel threatened, they conclude they are in danger. Emotion becomes evidence, and evidence becomes verdict. Stoicism interrupts this process, not by denying emotion, but by suspending the verdict, by creating a space between stimulus and response, a space where reason can act. That space is small at first, almost imperceptible, but it is there that autonomy begins to be born. Simple phrases start to gain internal weight, not as positive affirmations, but as anchors of clarity. This does not depend on me. This is only an impression. This is an event, not a judgment. This happens outside, not inside. These phrases do not solve everything immediately. They do not eliminate emotion, but they prevent it from becoming absolute. They prevent it from defining who you are. The shift in awareness happens when you realize that reacting is not mandatory. That feeling does not require action. That thinking does not require believing everything you think. This is a difficult point for many, because for years they learned that immediate reaction was a sign of authenticity. That holding back was repression. that observing before responding was coldness. Stoicism dismantles these beliefs. It shows that impulsive reaction is not being genuine, it is being predictable. That observing is not denying, it is understanding. That restraint is not repression, it is choice. Most people err because they confuse self-control with rigidity. But Stoic self-control is flexible. It does not harden the mind, it organizes it. When reason reclaims its place, something curious happens. External situations continue to occur, but they lose part of their impact. Not because they became irrelevant, but because they are no longer interpreted as threats to identity. Here an essential distinction emerges. What happens can be unpleasant, unfair, unexpected, but it does not have to become an attack on inner dignity. That dignity is not at the mercy of events. It is sustained by the stance taken toward them. Few people realize how often they give that dignity away every day. By arguing to prove worth, by explaining themselves to be accepted, by getting angry to be taken seriously, by staying silent out of fear of conflict. All of these are subtle forms of internal negotiation. Stoicism proposes reclaiming this territory, not through external confrontation but through clear internal limits. Limits that do not need to be announced. They reveal themselves through presence, through silence, through choice. Reason begins to ask, does this deserve my energy? Is this under my control? Does this contribute to my integrity? Or does it merely feed an old habit? These questions do not have emotional answers. They require lucid detachment. And it is precisely this detachment that many avoid, out of fear of losing their humanity. What they fail to see is that true humanity lies not in impulsive reaction, but in awareness. As this reframing begins to solidify, inner life changes pace. It is not about becoming immune to everything, but about becoming selective. What once passed through without a filter, now encounters rational resistance. Here, control takes on a new meaning. It is not controlling people, events, or outcomes. It is controlling internal consent. It is choosing which thoughts you give credibility to, which emotions you allow to take command. Epictetus spoke of assent, the idea that the mind is not obligated to agree with every impression that arises. This is one of the most liberating and least practiced ideas, because it demands internal vigilance. It demands presence. Most people live on emotional autopilot. They assent without noticing. They agree with the thought that appears. They believe the immediate interpretation. They react as they always have. The shift happens when this flow is interrupted, when it becomes clear that between impression and reaction there is an interval, small but real, and that within this interval lies freedom. This understanding does not bring euphoria. It brings sobriety, a strange sense of responsibility, because once you realize you have a choice, you lose the excuse of blaming the world. This is a delicate moment. Many retreat here. They prefer to keep believing they are victims of circumstances, because taking governance of one's own mind requires discipline, consistency, renouncing drama. But for those who remain, something deepens. The notion of limits, not limits imposed on others, but clear internal limits. Up to here I engage. Beyond this point I observe. Up to here this concerns me. Beyond this point it does not. These limits are not walls. They are criteria, and criteria bring peace. Reason begins to operate as a guardian, not preventing emotions from arising, but preventing them from making decisions on their own. Not denying pain, but preventing it from turning into identity. Gradually, the individual realizes that many battles never needed to be fought, that many conflicts existed only because there was internal agreement, that many offenses hurt only because they were accepted as truths. This realization is powerful, but still incomplete. It prepares something greater. Because once the mechanism is understood, a quiet expectation emerges. If this is true, then there is a concrete way to live differently, a practical way, an applicable way. But that way has not yet been fully revealed. It is close, but it requires integration. It requires everything observed so far to organize into a clear posture toward life. The mind begins to sense that this is not about a single principle, but about a structure, a way of thinking, an ongoing internal discipline. Something that, once embodied, profoundly changes the relationship with the world. And it is precisely at this point that the tension grows. Because understanding is mature enough to demand action, but has not yet been fully translated into conscious practice. Something essential is about to become clear, something that is neither theoretical nor abstract, but deeply concrete. Reason is about to definitively take the place that was always meant to be hers, reorganizing thoughts, emotions, and actions around a firm, silent, and stable axis, capable of sustaining the mind even when everything around it tries to pull it outward. This is where Stoicism stops being an interesting reflection and becomes a living discipline, not as theory but as daily practice, not as a distant ideal, but as a concrete posture toward real life. The climax is not in learning something new, but in taking responsibility for something ancient. Full responsibility for one's own mind. Epictetus never promised that nothing would happen. He taught something far more demanding, that nothing has to dominate you, that nothing has to hijack reason, that nothing has to cross your inner dignity without your consent. That is the central point. Consent. Everything that deeply affects someone has, at some level, been given permission. Not in a moral sense, but in a psychological one. The mind made space. Reason stepped aside. The judgment was accepted without examination. When this truth is finally faced, without defense, without escape, something reorganizes internally. There is no euphoria. There is steadiness. A quiet steadiness that does not need to be announced. From here on, application becomes possible. At the level of thoughts, change begins with vigilance, not tense vigilance, but lucid awareness. Thoughts continue to arise, as they always have. The difference is that they are no longer automatically treated as truths. They are seen as impressions, hypotheses, possible narratives, not final verdicts. When an interpretation of disrespect appears, reason intervenes. Is this a fact or a reading? When fear of others' judgment arises, reason asks, is this under my control? When the urge to respond, justify, or attack shows up, reason observes. What is really at stake here? This internal dialogue changes everything. Because it prevents the mind from being dragged by the first impulse, it creates space, and space is freedom. In the realm of emotions, Stoicism does not propose repression but direction. Emotions continue to exist: sadness, irritation, frustration, joy. The difference is that they no longer rule on their own. They are acknowledged, but not blindly obeyed. Feeling does not require acting. This simple understanding prevents countless unnecessary conflicts. It prevents words spoken in the heat of the moment. It prevents decisions made just to relieve immediate discomfort. It prevents trading lasting peace for short-term relief. Emotion becomes a signal, not a command. Something to be understood, not automatically followed. In conversations, the application becomes visible. The need to be right diminishes. The urgency to explain weakens. Silence stops being a threat and becomes a tool. Not every provocation requires a response. Not every criticism requires defense. Not every opinion requires agreement or confrontation. Many conversations lose their power simply because they no longer find emotional buy-in. This is not passivity. It is selectivity. Speaking becomes a choice, not a reflex. The tone changes. Presence asserts itself without effort. Because those who do not react impulsively transmit something rare: stability. In silent boundaries, Stoicism reveals one of its most refined strengths. Boundaries do not need to be announced aggressively. They show themselves through consistency between thought, word, and action. Up to here I engage. Beyond this point I do not. Not because the other changed, but because reason decided. These boundaries protect mental energy. They prevent unnecessary exposure. They preserve emotional dignity. And over time they change relationship dynamics. Reactive people attract conflict. Stable people command quiet respect. In daily life, this translates into simple choices. Not entering arguments that lead nowhere, not ruminating on offenses, not carrying problems that cannot be solved, not negotiating principles just to maintain momentary comfort. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that life is too short to be wasted on useless disturbances. Not because problems stop existing, but because the mind learns not to dissolve into them. This is the essence of Stoic principles that make someone less vulnerable to the world, not by becoming untouchable, but by becoming self-governed. Nothing can deeply affect someone who does not surrender command of their own mind. This does not happen overnight. It is practice, training, conscious repetition. There will be setbacks, moments of irritation, old patterns trying to return. Stoicism does not promise perfection. It promises direction. Each time reason regains control, even briefly, something strengthens. An inner axis, a sense of alignment, a tranquility that does not depend on circumstances. In the end, the deepest transformation is not emotional. It is ethical. It is the choice to live according to what is under your control and to accept, with sobriety, what is not. That choice restores something essential, the dignity of not being a hostage. Not a hostage to others' moods, not a hostage to circumstances, not a hostage to one's own emotions. The mind becomes a livable place, not a battlefield, a space where reason guides, emotions inform, and awareness decides. This responsibility cannot be outsourced. No one can protect your mind for you. No one can choose your internal consent. No one can filter your judgments. Taking this on is real maturity, and when that responsibility is assumed, something changes permanently. The world remains unstable. People remain unpredictable. Life remains uncertain. But the relationship with all of it becomes more just, more lucid, more steady. If this reflection helped organize your thoughts, not as comfort, but as clarity, it may be worth staying in this practice of conscious attention. Subscribing to the channel is simply a way to continue that mental training, without excess, without noise. Liking the video helps keep this kind of content alive. And commenting, even with just a few words, is an honest way to acknowledge what touched something essential in you.